Molly, thank you. Let me just stay with you for a second. We're going to move out that way. The consortium have been looking at these issues for quite some time. So I'd like you to comment on the strength of the evidence you have. How confident are you that we can take stock in what you've learned?
The Organizing Schools book looked at student and teacher surveys from a 10-plus year span. And so the evidence, I think, is very strong because we've been looking at it over time. And what they did is they looked at, improvement in a unique way. They looked at gains in gains. So how a school is able to grow at a faster pace, improve at a faster pace. So it's 10 years of evidence based on teacher and student voice and what they're saying about their school. So I think it's very strong.
Alan and Kara, you have been mapping relationships. That work, visually at least, looks like it's new, like there hasn't been as much of that going on. How new is this work? And could you say something about the underlying data so we can get a better sense of what you're actually looking at?
So maybe I'll take the first part of the question, which is like the new, can you all hear me? Great. So I'll take the first part about like how new is this social networky stuff. It's relatively new in education. It's actually been around since 1932, and there's been some interesting hand-drawn network maps since that period of time. And it was really being used in a variety of different fields. There was some early work that happened in the 90s, but I would say in the last probably 8 years or so, there's been a real resurgence behind, taking a social perspective, but then what does it look like when we can map out the relationships? And I think our technology, our ability to map these things is also really increased tremendously. So we can map, big giant networks of 50, 60, 100,000 people in ways that we weren't able to before. So I think we've got a set of tools that are enabling us to take what's been invisible but existing and make visible in ways that we can see it. So I think there's been a much bigger growth here at ARA and research in general in education.
You want me to take the data one? Okay, in terms of the data, that probably is helpful to know. The data that we collect, the quantitative data that we collect, is through an online survey, and we work with a district at the very beginning so that there are a lot of people who understand the kinds of data that we would be gathering, and then we work with the district to figure out how to also share that with the people who we'd be gathering the data from, because it's a pretty time-intensive process. The survey is a series of questions that asks about your relationships in different areas. So they could be what we call instrumental ties, which are more work-related, or more emotional ties, like who do you turn to if you have a problem kind of thing. And both of those are important in the literature. And so what we ask is a series of questions around the frequency of those ties, how often do you turn to people, or the existence of those ties. And what we do in our work is a bounded network, and so it would be as if we had everybody in this room on a list. And then you would say, I go to this person, I don't go to this person, and go through the series, and that's why it takes so long. And so when we work with a district in our work, we try to help them understand how this is going to be a different type of information than they've ever gotten before. And we'll work with them to show what that means to them later. So we go back to them with the data and have them look at it and think about, well, what does this mean for our district? And so that's been useful because you really need a high percentage of people to respond to have valid and reliable data to use.
Just one small point on this.
Be sure to speak into that microphone there, Telly.
I think the other key bit here is that of course, this is all based on graph theory, so all those pretty visuals you're seeing, they're all based in graph theory, so we can generate a lot of metrics that are behind that. And in fact, the metrics are likely the things we use in our analysis. However, providing those visuals opens people up in a way when we start thinking about how do we visualize data, how do we present it, and how can people enter it in a way that if we just gave them a stream of numbers, wouldn't engage them in the same way.
So let's just stay with this metrics thing. I mean, I've been sitting here wondering, or standing here, wondering, what would happen? What would you tell Molly she could add to their research in Chicago? What could you measure using these research approaches that would complement or augment what they're doing? So tell her.
So first of all, the consortium does amazing work. So if I was to say anything, which they're likely already doing, I think for our work, we've tried to conceptualize what might be some proxy measures for trust in terms of a structure. But we've been also asking people, with whom do you share personal information candidly, right, as sort of a proxy measure for trust to draw those particular networks. But I think you're already engaged in some of this work, and I would think like when you're using metrics like reciprocity, like Kara talked about, we can generate a list of metrics around reciprocity. We can also think about the strength of ties that people have, depending on how we want to ask that. So I think, based on your point, Ken, I think there's some really nice overlap between the work that the consortium is doing, that we're doing, and actually, as I look out in the audience, many of the people sitting out here in the room as well.
Molly, is there anything you would like to tell Alan and Karen that, based on your work, that they could consider as they're mapping the strength of relationships? I'm particularly, I think it's hugely important, you said, where the relationships are strong and durable and lasting, we see deeper learning outcomes. So,
Yep. Well, and I think this, it's not just work from the consortium, but also, work from other researchers out here and work that I did with lots of colleagues here on leadership as well, that, when somebody leaves, so you had those networks and what happens when somebody leaves, part of the work that we know is that churn has less of a effect on outcomes when those schools have that strong professional community and trust in it. So I think it'd be really interesting to see the strength of those, that the overall trust in professional community in schools and what happens when a principal leaves or, when a teacher leader leaves. Is that impact felt less strongly?
wonderful. They're warmed up now, and we're ready. We're ready. What do you have for us? She's going to need a microphone too, right?
I'm a union president in a local, and I'm very curious whether or not, as you were researching the impact of good relationships and how churn negatively impacts good relationships, did you also uncover what happens when somebody who is toxic and adds negative energy to the relationship leaves, and whether that kind of churn actually ends up to be positive?
So a couple thoughts on that. So most of the network work that we're talking about has a sort of pro-social bent to it, right? But recently we have a paper that just came out in the American Journal of Education around difficult ties. So we were specifically interested in that. So there's a pretty strong literature base suggesting that folks that are toxic in the system sometimes actually have more impact on the system than those folks that are really pro-social, right? And likely, although it's probably not true for anybody in this room, you've probably worked in organizations or you know somebody that wasn't so pleasant to work with, and you know you have to engage in all these workarounds. I'm sure that's no one in here, but you had to engage in all of these workarounds. And so the idea of thinking about difficult ties is actually something that's really important. We haven't, because that's a really hard question to ask people, right? Like, who's the not so pleasant person to work with? We couch it in ways where we say, with whom do you have a difficult professional relationship? By difficult, we mean difficulty sharing communication, coming to an understanding, you know, some of the qualities that make up difficult folks. And so that's a difficult question to ask. So we've recently just been asking that along with its sister question, which is the energy question, which is like, who gives you energy after exchanging and interacting with them? Because we often think about the energy vampires, like who's sucking the energy out of the room. So we've been trying to look at these things in two different ways, but we haven't tracked that, or we haven't analyzed the data yet to look at that over time. But I think it's a really important area for study, although a difficult one to engage.
All right, Michael?
Yep. I have a comment. There is a difference between a network and a social system. A social system has a purpose, and none of the elements can be evaluated by itself, but only in the sense that they interact to support the purpose of the system. Our problem is our schools are not social systems. I think they need the elements that Molly talks about. They need leadership that creates a common purpose and develops the kinds of networks you're talking about. But I think we need to understand what a social system is, that schools will not achieve their purpose without becoming a learning organization, social system.
You know, you've got to stand right next to the people you hand the microphone to so that you can get it back quickly.
Can I
Yes, please.
I just wanted to mention that in our data set, we also have data around organizational learning and trust that are measured differently from our network data to get at some of these exact things you're talking about, so that we can look at how people feel, whether they feel a part of the social system, whether they feel opportunities to take risks and try new things and learn together separately from these connections that we have about who do they turn to. It's a way to both like triangulate the data and also to dig deeper into some of these conditions that you're talking about.
And thank you for converting his important comment into a question.
You're welcome.
So it sounds like your research goes back 10 years or so, but I'm wondering if there's other literature that gives us a sense of how these things have changed over decades. I mean, do we have a sense of whether there's more or less churn in systems now than there used to be, more or less trust? And do you have any working theories as to why? What kinds of policies or social trends might have an influence on systemic trust?
We're very young.
I'll just tackle the churn one and policies. I mean, in the places that we were studying in the districts, there, you know, it was right at the time where some of the policies around moving principals were going on, or moving principals out of low-performing schools. And so there was a way that policy was both contributing to churn directly and then indirectly through some of the accountability pressures that we know through our qualitative data when people would talk about why people were leaving, how hard it was to work in this district, central office reorganizations and things like that. So I can't answer whether there has been more or less empirically from our data because of the time period we're looking at, and I don't know of data that looked at it in the same way decades ago, but I think we have some very clear ways of understanding the conditions that were aggravating the system in this time period.
I think we should come back to that question when Susan Moore Johnson is with us this afternoon. Mm-hmm. We might bring it up when Linda's here to talk about patterns in the profession. I think she's just finished a new analysis, some things. It was a great question.
So this work seems to talk about teachers and school leaders as the learners in the system, and I wondered if your work, or if you were aware of any work that had applied this to students as learners and to parents through your survey work, and if it had implications for cohorts of students who learn together and for schools that experience high mobility among students and among the parents that are connected to the school.
Question. So we do ask students about their peer relationships and the support that they feel from their peers for improving academic outcomes. And that was one of the things that we had up there, that a strong adult professional community does impact the professional community of the students, and the social community of the students, the learning community of the students. Do you want to?
There's been some work done around youth, and primarily a lot of it has to do with alcohol and smoking. And so looking at peer influence kinds of behaviors. We have a project that's funded by the EU now that's looking at students in special education. This is another really big group of folks that we don't often talk about, and their peer relationship. So I think we're going to see more coming out on the idea of the peer relationship. I think one of the things Kara and I have always dreamt about, probably need to get different dreams, but it would be the idea of mapping an entire system from the students, the teachers, the leaders, out into the community, right? Like, what does this larger kind of system look like, and thinking about it. So it's an exciting area if that's something you're pursuing.
You want to?
I was just going to add one other. I think it is becoming more common, as everybody's suggesting, to use this network analysis. And I just heard a study around English language learners and how they were being grouped in classrooms and how that was impacting their learning. So I think there is growing numbers of people who are doing this work, research this work, and you could dig around and maybe find a little of it.
As it always happens, right as we get close to the end of our exchange time, that's when you see many hands starting to pop up. I'm saying that so that we get the comments or questions to come quickly.
This is a quick one. We know racial segregation is growing in American schools. We know we have serious issues with teacher diversity. Have you looked at the interaction between race and social relations and trust in your research, and what can you tell us about that, if anything?
Yeah, I'm not sure if we have looked at that, actually.
We gather that data, but we haven't done that analysis in terms of our networks. But that's another really rich area to dig into, as well as issues around gender. This is another really important issue that we've got to be thinking about and more active on.
My prediction is that if you mapped the increased segregation of communities and hence schools and then looked inside, you'd see more instability and greater churn and more difficult ties. And then we'll come up here.
Yeah, this is just a little bit of a comment. We're here at the Shanker Institute, and the issue of the union in terms of its place in this network building that you're talking about has not really been discussed. And I know for years and years, one of the quandaries for the union was how to bring the people together who work on working conditions for teachers that and the people who are caring and working on educational progress for the kids. And I just think it's important to raise this because the agenda for the American Federation of Teachers has been, and not always successfully, to try to integrate these two roles. And I think that it's a mission for the union. And I'm building this on what Michael Maccabee said, who actually worked on the Futures Committee project with Al Shanker in trying to think through some of these larger questions. And when he said, you have to think about these networks in terms of their purpose, just made me want to stand up and say, you've got to plug the union in, or we have to plug the union in if it isn't there.
All right, well, we've got, according to the timekeeper, 60 seconds. And you guys don't have a microphone, which
Two real short things. One is, do you have a paper or reference for the Chicago work that you said we have recent research in? Where would I find it?
Yeah, so all of our reports are available on our website. I also attached the links to the reports that I referenced that will be available on the slides that they will post after this day.
And second, was your work, I would think there might be a difference in community support needs for high school versus middle school versus elementary school. Were you working with all three levels and found the same results?
You know what, that was on elementary middle. So Chicago has K-8s mostly. So it was elementary middle. I know that there's been recent work on the 5 essentials in high schools. And truthfully, I'd have to go back and see if they found the same strength of those parent-community ties, but it is very, very important. Obviously, we know it looks different at the different levels, and so I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but the Organizing Schools book was elementary middle school.
Barnett, you're going to get the last word, maybe even instead of the panel.
Okay, it's a pretty big question. I'm going to keep it short, and it's from a fellow who's been lucky enough to work with thousands of teachers in virtual space for over a dozen years, so they can connect, learn, and trust and build solutions with each other anytime, anywhere. So in the last couple of years of your studies, have you found how virtual space and increasingly opportunities for teachers to connect outside their districts and schools that impacts positively their ability to influence and support their colleagues?
I'll take this one. In our work specifically, we did ask how people were communicating, interacting, but we weren't getting into the virtual kind of communities that you're talking about. And I actually think this is the next frontier for all of us. And so this is a really important space. I know Joelle Rodway from University of Toronto is here. She's doing some work in that space. We've been working with Joe Bowler at Stanford and trying to look at her community. And I think this is a really powerful way to conceptualize these communities as communities and then looking at the interactions to understand what's moving in the systems in the same way that Karen and I are looking at what's moving in much more narrowly focused systems. So I think this is a really important area for all of us to take that next step into. Right.
Well, I think we have modeled well how the day is supposed to go. We've kept good time, and I'd like you all to help me thank Molly, Kara, and Alex.